Hi there, welcome to my course on Spring Boot. In this lesson, we're going to focus on how to use Spring Boot data JPA in a Spring Boot application. We will quickly build an end-to-end Spring Boot application using REST API and Spring Data JPA. Spring Data JPA immensely simplified implementation of data access and persistence layer. No need to write a lot of boilerplate code in DAO layer with Spring Data JPA. Developer needs to create just repository interfaces, including custom finder methods, and Spring actually automatically provides the implementation. Next, we will build a web app. We will create a simple project, Spring Boot project using Maven, and then we will build a question bank RESTful web app using Spring Data JPA. Question bank application UI is going to look something like this. It will have a list of existing questions that will be displayed. Users will have the ability to add new question, or they can view an existing question, update an existing question, and also delete an existing question. Question Bank Spring Boot application will have an architecture with REST API built using Spring MVC, which will implement all the endpoints. The persistence layer will be built using Spring Data JPA and H2 database. And we will have a web client, an Angular web client to view and update the data. This table shows the various use cases used in the question bank application, and also shows how the various use cases, the data requirement will be met by the REST API endpoint. List questions will use get and endpoint API question. Create question will use post and endpoint API questions. View question will use get and pass the question ID as a path variable. Update question will also use pass the path variable and use post. Delete is going to use delete and pass the ID. Question bank will have a POM file which will look like this. The parent section will have Spring Boot starter parent specified as the artifact. The version is also specified here. Just to reiterate, this is the only place where the version is specified, and all libraries used in the project are based on this, and this eliminates any conflict between the Spring libraries. Since this is going to be a web application, we will add a dependency for Spring Boot starter web. We are going to use Spring Data JPA in this application. So we need to add the starter data JPA Spring Boot module, and also we are going to use in-memory H2 database. So for that I have added two dependencies. So one is for Spring Boot starter data JPA, and the next one is for in-memory H2 database. We can specify the data source properties for our H2 database that we are going to use for persistence in the application properties file. Spring Boot looks for the application.properties file at the root of the class path. All application properties can be specified in this file. I have some examples here. For logging.level, you can specify that here. Server.port, normally it is 8080, but you can set it to a different port in this application file, in properties file. We are using H2 database, so we can enable the H2 console by enabling it to true in this properties file. This way we can browse the H2 database objects from the browser. Also for our H2 database, we are going to set up the data source URL, username, password, driver class in this properties file. We can set up the connection pooling properties also in this file. I'll talk more about this, but these are some additional properties here for setting up the connection pooling for our data source. Next, in Eclipse, we will look at the code that I have for this question bank application using REST API and Spring Data JPA. So this is the Maven project that I have for Spring Boot question bank application. We'll look at the POM file. So this has in the parent section, it has the Spring Boot starter parent, Here is the dependency for Spring Boot Starter Web, and because we are going to use Spring Data JPA, so we have this dependency for Spring Boot Starter Data JPA, and for the H2 database, this is the dependency for that. Let's take a quick look at the dependency hierarchy. So we added the Spring Boot Starter JPA, and Spring Boot actually automatically added all the transitive dependencies. So we have all these other libraries which were added that's needed for using Spring Data JPA. So there is Spring Boot Starter JDBC, there is this Hibernate Entity Manager, Spring Data JPA, and also we have the libraries needed for H2 database. This application has a question controller which implements all the REST API endpoints needed for this application. It is a REST controller mapped to endpoint API, and for meeting the various use cases such as list is mapped to questions. It's a get method. Similarly, it's mapped to create endpoint create, which has the endpoint questions with post, get, update, delete. So all the endpoints are implemented in this controller to meet all the use case requirements. Interesting thing to note here is this REST controller is going to use question repository. So question repository will give access to the data layer using Spring Data JPA. We will now start our Spring Boot application, so we can take a quick look at the H2 database. And also I'm going to show you that now that we added the Spring Data JPA and the H2 database dependency, so you should be able to see that in this Spring Boot console. So it has this for H2, and you can see this logs coming over from Hibernate. It's using the H2 dialect. So just by adding those two dependencies in our POM file, we are able to use Spring Data JPA, and we are also able to use the H2 database. So it makes it really easy to configure and use databases using Spring Boot. So we'll go quickly to the browser, so that so this is the H2 console. So since we enabled H2 console, so we can connect to the database from here. So I just connected to the H2 database that we are going to use, and we can access it because when Spring Boot started, so now the database is also available for use. So we just have one table in this database for our question bank application. So there is a question bank table. It has an ID column, it has question description, the subject for the question, and the answer. And I have some test data in this table, so I can quickly show you that. So if I click run, so these are some sample questions that is already there in the database. So it has a subject of Spring Boot and a question like what is Spring Boot. It is a framework that makes it easy to develop Spring application. So it has questions like that. Back in Eclipse, we are going to look at the question model object. So this is going to hold the data for our question, and this is mapped to the question table that we looked at. So it is using the annotation entity which tells Spring Data JPA that this should be mapped to the database table question. Since it has the same name, so I don't have additional annotations. It has the following attributes: ID, subject, description, answer. They all have the same name as the database column names, so additional annotation is not needed. For the ID, the primary key column, I have this annotation ID, and the generated value annotation is there for auto incrementing the ID, so that when a new record is inserted in the table, it will automatically have the next ID. Spring Data JPA makes it really easy to access data from the database. There is no need to write a lot of boilerplate code as we used to do in the DAO layer. All a developer needs to do is create this interface question repository for accessing the question data. It needs to extend JPA repository, and we do need to specify the model object question in this case, and that is how Spring knows what data that this repository should retrieve. We do need to specify the type for the ID column. Now that we have this question repository, we can use it from our question controller to meet all the data requirements. So we have auto-wired question repository in our question controller. The list method, which needs to get all the existing question, can simply use the question repository.findAll, which will retrieve all the questions from the database. For create, which is a post and gets the question data and the request body, it can simply use that data and call this method save and flush on question repository to save the data in the database and create a new question. For getting a particular question by ID, we use the question repository.findOne. So it's going to find that one question based on the ID and return it back. Update needs to retrieve the existing question by ID, and then the updated question which is coming in the request body, it needs to copy the data from this updated question into the existing question. For that, it's using the binutils copy properties. And once we have all the changes in the existing question, we can simply call save and flush on question repository to save the updated question in the database. For delete, we just find and get the existing question and simply call the delete method to delete the data. UI for this application has been done using Angular, which are all here, the views for that, and which I'll cover in a different tutorial. Having created the UI, the REST API, and the repository layer for this application, we can now go to the browser and actually start run and test our application from the browser. So I'll go to the browser, and so I just visited the URL. So it is now showing me all the questions which are there in the database, and I can go and view any existing question and click on edit to edit an existing question. I can make a small change and save it, test change, and then save it, and we can quickly check that in the database. In the H2 console, I can run this select statement, and I can see that the question subject has been modified. So we just completed the creating the question bank application, and we did some quick testing. So we built a Spring Boot application using REST API and Spring Data JPA. We learned how to configure dependencies for Spring Data JPA and H2 database. We demonstrated how easily and quickly we can build an end-to-end application using Spring Boot. Hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I look forward to talking to you again in a subsequent lesson. Thanks for watching.